From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So, if you like today's story, the next time the follow button is not home, release a family of wild raccoons into their attic. This episode is called Needle in a Haystack. Josie Baker smiled as she watched her 4-year-old daughter, Lila, hunt for frogs near the stream behind their house. Josie's other daughter, 1-year-old Adelaide, gripped her mother's hand as she wobbled forward to see what her big sister was up to. On this sunny afternoon in late March of 2021, the 24-year-old mother felt like her dreams were actually coming true. Just over a year ago, Josie had moved into this small house in the farmlands north of Dallas, Texas, with her family. They all loved the fresh air and wide open space, and little Lila had become close friends with the cows that grazed in the pasture next door. Josie shared her daughter's love of animals. She actually worked as a veterinary assistant in a local animal hospital, and the family had even taken in a pet raccoon named Jinx. Josie checked her watch and realized her husband, Dustin, would be home soon from his job as a firefighter and paramedic, and so she needed to start fixing dinner. She called out to Lila and scooped up baby Adelaide. Then the whole crew headed for the back door of their house. But the moment Josie stepped inside the house, she was overwhelmed by a strong floral smell, like someone nearby was wearing way too much perfume. Josie held her nose and peeked inside the kitchen. And it was a total mess. Cabinet doors were wide open, and it looked like the food inside had been hurled across the room. Boxes of cereal and bags of chips were ripped open and spilled all over the counter and the floor. The cabinet under the kitchen sink was also open, and broken bottles of dishwashing detergent and other cleaning supplies were spread out all over the place. And when Josie looked closely, she saw something else. Tiny animal footprints tracking the mess out of the room. Now, Josie knew exactly what had happened to her kitchen. Jinx, their raccoon, had ransacked it. Jinx was supposed to live in an enclosure in the living room, but clearly he'd escaped and decided to have some fun in the kitchen. Josie ultimately found Jinx hiding under the bed in Lila's bedroom, and while she was mad, she couldn't really stay mad at him as he stared out at her with his little black cute eyes. And so Josie coaxed him out with some food before picking him up and returning him to his pen. As she swept up the broken glass in the kitchen, Josie felt like she actually had kind of dodged a bullet here. Because, this could have been a whole lot worse if maybe her girls had come into the house ahead of her and maybe got cut on all the shards of glass lying around. And so as she dumped the trash into a wastebasket, she had to admit to herself that all in all, the whole scene in front of her was actually kind of funny. While the house may be a total mess and a total pain to clean up, one thing was certain. Their little raccoon Jinx, after breaking into all the cleaning supplies, was now the sweetest smelling raccoon in the state of Texas. 2 weeks later, after tucking in the girls for the night, Josie walked back out to the living room to snuggle up on the couch with her husband Dustin. But when she stepped into the room, she found Dustin standing in the corner, staring into Jinx's enclosure. Josie was curious, and so she walked over to see what he was looking at, and when she looked down, she gasped. Jinx was acting so weird. The raccoon swayed and staggered as he walked around his enclosure, almost like he was drunk. He also kept bumping into objects and walls, which made Josie think maybe his vision was impaired. Because of her job as a veterinary technician, Josie had been around plenty of sick animals, but Jinx's condition was something she'd actually never seen before in any other animal. So she told Dustin that she would bring Jinx with her to the animal hospital first thing in the morning. The next morning, Josie stood by while one of the vets at her hospital examined her raccoon. But after a few minutes, the vet turned to Josie and admitted that they too were totally stumped by whatever was bothering Jinx. They didn't understand what it was. Josie agreed that the best course of action now would be to keep Jinx under observation at the hospital and run some additional tests. But over the course of his stay, nothing the veterinarians did seemed to help Jinx, and in fact, Jinx just seemed to get sicker and sicker until he basically just lay in his cage, panting with his tongue out. And then 2 days after he had come to the hospital, Jinx died. Josie was devastated, but she was far more concerned about how her daughter Lila would react to Jinx's passing. she was going to be absolutely heartbroken. The day after Jinx's death, the Baker family walked solemnly down the path behind their house towards the stream, and they buried Jinx under a tree. At the end of the service, Josie kneeled down and helped a very sad Lila plant flowers atop her beloved pet's final resting place. A few weeks later, on the afternoon of May 29th, Josie sat on her living room couch right next to Lila, who for the past couple of days had been vomiting and running a fever. Her pediatrician had said that it was probably just the stomach flu and recommended rest and fluids. So Josie had pulled together all these pillows and blankets and put them on the couch to let her daughter relax and watch TV while she recuperated. However, as Josie looked at her sleeping daughter beside her, she felt increasingly worried. Josie had been carefully following the doctor's instructions, but Lila's fever really hadn't broken yet, and she was still struggling to keep her food down. Lila had been sleeping for a couple of hours now, so Josie gently placed her hand on Lila's forehead and whispered to her to wake up so she could drink some water. But as Lila slowly opened her eyes, Josie could see that they looked glazed over and unfocused. Josie tried to help Lila sit up, but the little girl could barely lift her head. Josie immediately wrapped her daughter in a blanket and carried her to the car. Her barely conscious 4-year-old needed to see a doctor right away. Later that day, Josie climbed out of an ambulance outside of the Children's Hospital in Dallas, Texas, while orderlies ran to help unload Lila from the back. The doctor at their local hospital, where Josie had gone first, had told Josie that based on her daughter's condition, this local hospital could not help her. They needed specialized care. So Lila had been rushed in an ambulance to a major pediatric hospital instead. Once Lila was unloaded from the ambulance, she was immediately taken up to the intensive care unit. At the same time, a doctor named Catherine Merrill met with Josie in the hallway to explain what they were going to do to treat her daughter. Dr. Merrill said that Lila's white blood cell count was very high, which was a strong indicator that Lila was fighting off an infection. Josie listened carefully as the doctor laid out the range of tests they planned to run to try to figure out where this infection came from and where it was located in Lila's body. Dr. Merrill also explained that while the testing was in progress, they would also be administering antibiotics to Lila to help her fight off whatever this infection was. As they talked, Josie could hear her daughter throwing up again, so Josie quickly thanked the doctor and rushed back to her daughter's bedside. Over the next couple of days, the doctors and nurses and medical team ran dozens of tests on Lila, but unfortunately, the results of those tests didn't really tell them anything. All the tests could confirm was that whatever was going on with Lila was not one of the common suspects, like bacterial meningitis or a foodborne disease like salmonella. And as each test came back basically showing nothing, Dr. Merrill became more and more confused. Meanwhile, Lila's condition grew even worse. Her frequent vomiting caused her to have trouble breathing, which led to low oxygen levels in her blood. So Dr. Merrill decided to insert a breathing tube through Lila's nose and down her windpipe, requiring the little girl to be heavily sedated. Lila's illness consumed the entire family, as first Josie and then Dustin took leave from their jobs so they could spend more time at the hospital with their girl. But day after day, no new information came in, and Lila kept getting worse. Not only was she completely incapable of holding her head up now, she couldn't even walk or speak. And so it wasn't long before Josie and Dustin began to fear the worst, that they might never get their sweet, energetic 4-year-old back. One night in June, nearly 2 weeks after Lila got sick, Dr. Merrill entered Lila's hospital room and found her parents at her bedside as usual. After giving Lila an extensive examination, Dr. Merrill thought that this infection was actually attacking Lila's brain and nervous system. In order to find out for sure, Lila's doctors would perform a brain biopsy, which meant they would cut a small opening in Lila's skull to acquire tiny samples of her brain tissue. Josie thought that sounded like a very intense operation for such a young girl in such a weakened state already, but the brain biopsy was also their best remaining hope to find out what was going on with her. So Josie and Dustin looked at each other for a moment, and it was clear they both understood they didn't really have a choice here. They had to do this. So they told Dr. Merrill, to go ahead with the procedure. A few days later, Josie sat by Lila's hospital bed and read to her from her favorite book, while Dustin napped nearby in a chair. Lila was still not able to speak or walk, but she had made it through the brain biopsy just fine and was actually starting to show small signs of improvement. And so Josie was actually feeling optimistic for the first time in a while. But moments later, Dr. Merrill entered and pulled up a chair to speak with the parents. The results had come back from the brain biopsy, and there was finally an answer to what was ailing their daughter. But the answer was not a good one. Dr. Merrill said that Lila was suffering from a rare and potentially deadly bacterial infection known as melioidosis. The doctor explained that once this bacteria invades a person's system, it causes pus-filled abscesses in whatever tissue it reaches, which is why nearly 40% of melioidosis patients die. And in Lila's case, the bacteria had entered her brain and nervous system, which was why she was having so much trouble moving and speaking, and seemed very disoriented. All of this was obviously totally devastating to Josie and Dustin, but the doctor told the very upset parents that there actually was reason for hope. Now that they actually knew which bacteria was making their daughter sick, they could give her the right antibiotics to help Lila try to defeat the infection once and for all. 2 weeks after Lila's brain biopsy, a woman in her 20s named Julia Petrus arrived at the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC for short, in Atlanta, Georgia, for her first day as an epidemic intelligence officer. For years, Julia had worked as a nurse, providing health services to refugees in Bangladesh and Uganda. More recently, she provided medical care for homeless people in Santa Barbara, California, in the early stages of the COVID pandemic. And now she was excited to take on a new challenge. As an epidemic intelligence officer, Julia was now basically a disease detective who would investigate mysterious outbreaks and do her best to prevent the spread of infections. As Julia sat down at her desk and checked her email inbox for the first time, she could see that she was already invited to a Zoom meeting that was starting in just a few minutes. CDC officials would be briefing the FBI about a recent outbreak of melioidosis, a very rare bacterial infection. Julia was familiar with melioidosis, but she didn't understand why this disease would involve the FBI, an agency that investigates crimes. But regardless, moments later, Julia clicked the link on her calendar and logged into the Zoom meeting. After a quick round of introductions, a CDC official began the briefing with a discussion of the case of 4-year-old Lila Baker, who was still in the Dallas Children's Hospital suffering from melioidosis. Julia also learned from this meeting that 2 other cases of melioidosis had been reported in the U.S. in the last 4 months. There was a woman in Kansas who died 9 days after being admitted to the hospital, and a man in Minnesota who was still fighting his symptoms. But there was something strange about all 3 of these cases. Melioidosis was caused by a bacteria that, for all intents and purposes, did not exist in the United States. The bacteria was mostly found in Southeast Asia and Northern Australia. Usually, the only way a person in the United States got melioidosis was by traveling to a region of the world where the bacteria was present. But none of these 3 patients had traveled outside the United States anytime recently. Julia could understand why the CDC wanted to get to the bottom of this mystery. It obviously was in their purview, but she still wasn't sure why the FBI was on this call with them. And it was at this point that one of her colleagues reminded the other attendees on the meeting that this bacteria was so toxic that it was classified as a Tier 1 select agent, and the federal government viewed it as a potential weapon if it got into the wrong hands. And so at this point, the official said the CDC could not rule out the possibility that this melioidosis bacteria had been released into the United States intentionally. Meaning this could potentially be an act of bioterrorism, which is why the FBI was now being briefed up on the situation. Julia was absolutely shocked at this revelation. This was quite an assignment for her first day on the job, and it wasn't even lunchtime. Before her wild first day at the CDC was over, Julia had ordered DNA analysis from the bacteria that was collected from the 3 patients. and within days, the results confirmed exactly what the CDC had feared. The 3 samples were genetically identical, meaning they had all come from the same place. And further investigation revealed to Julia and her colleagues that this particular strain of bacteria could be traced to southern Asia. Julia's next question was, how did the bacteria move all the way from Asia to 3 separate households in the United States? Had it come here on an infected plant or animal, in soil, or a commercial product? Or could it actually have been spread by a bioterrorist who just wanted to hurt people? There were literally thousands of possibilities, and Julia knew that the only way to narrow them down was to find out what the 3 victim households had in common. So she picked up the phone and started calling all the families of the victims. She needed to let them know that the CDC was going to go to their homes and search them. A few days later, Julia drove through the wide-open farmlands of northern Texas on her way to the home of the Baker family. The day before, she had spoken with Josie and Dustin Baker about the need for her to come and collect samples from their property. Other CDC officers were going to scour the homes of the patients from Kansas and Minnesota with the same goal, finding melioidosis bacteria. As Julia pulled her car into the gravel driveway in front of the Baker's home, a woman came out and introduced herself as Josie's sister. She said that Josie and Dustin were still at the hospital with Lila, but she was here now to let Julia know that she had free rein to collect whatever material she thought was relevant to her investigation. Julia thanked her, then started searching every inch of the Baker property for anything that looked like it could have come from Asia. She collected samples of food and cleaning products and placed them in plastic bags. Then she scraped algae from an empty aquarium she found behind the house, since there had been cases where imported tropical fish carried the deadly bacteria. Finally, Julia took soil samples from the bank of the stream near the house, as well as from the plants. As Julia waved to the sister and drove away from the Baker's home, she felt she had been very thorough in her investigation. Although she was still new to this job, she felt like it was very possible to her that the bacteria they were looking for was hidden inside one of the bags and bottles in the trunk of her car right now. A couple of weeks later, in late July, Julia sat in a conference room with the other CDC investigators on her team. Julia scrolled through the pages of laboratory results on her laptop, but she admitted to her colleagues that she was totally stumped. Investigators had gathered hundreds of samples from the 3 locations where people got sick, but none of them contained any trace of the bacteria. But before Julia could start to discuss next steps, one of her colleagues cleared his throat and asked for everyone's attention. Then he read out loud from an email that had just come in on his phone. And as he read, Julia grew even more troubled. The CDC had just gotten word of a 4th case of melioidosis. This one was in Georgia. The patient was a 5-year-old boy who, like the other 3 patients, had never traveled to any region of the world where this bacteria was present. DNA analysis showed that the bacteria that infected him was identical to the samples from the other 3 patients. So he'd most likely gotten it from the same source as all the other patients. Julia closed her eyes as she thought about this new information. The news from Georgia was obviously distressing, but the fact that only one new case had emerged over the course of the last month was probably good news. If terrorists were trying to use the bacteria as a weapon, wouldn't there be many more victims by now? Julia was beginning to think that this outbreak couldn't be an act of bioterrorism. But if this outbreak wasn't bioterrorism, then what was it? Something was causing people to get sick all across the country, and the CDC had no idea what it was. As Julia walked back to her office, lost in thought, she suddenly felt resolved. Their investigation had indeed been thorough and comprehensive, but clearly they had to do more. A few weeks later, on a warm evening in the middle of August 2021, Josie Baker stood by Lila as her daughter's wheelchair was lowered from a van to the ground outside their home. Friends and family were gathered by the front door, clapping and cheering. After 2.5 months in the hospital, Lila was finally home. Josie was overwhelmed with emotion as she carefully pushed her daughter up a ramp that had been installed outside their house just a week prior. Lila's physical condition had stabilized and she was now breathing on her own, But as Josie watched Dustin lift Lila out of her wheelchair and gently lay her on her bed, Josie also knew that there was a long and challenging road ahead of them. Lila had still not regained her ability to speak or walk. Even holding her head upright continued to be a challenge. Josie had to accept a painful truth. There was a good possibility that her daughter had suffered permanent damage to her nervous system. And Josie had another worry. She still had no idea how or where Lila had picked up the bacteria. CDC investigators had not found the bacteria on their property, but it still seemed possible to Josie that it could still be lurking somewhere in their house. So she couldn't shake the idea that if they continued to live in this house, at some point, somebody else in the family was going to get this disease as well. Later that same month, in one of the conference rooms for the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Julia picked up a dry erase pen and started drawing on a whiteboard. Julia had been on the case for almost 2 months, and the agency still had no clue how the 4 patients had contracted this bacteria. Julia knew time was running out to solve this puzzle. The more time passed, the greater the chance that the source of the bacteria might be spread to other locations. So Julia thought, maybe if she just wrote down everything they knew on this whiteboard, that maybe somehow it would help her connect all the dots. Julia's colleagues watched as she divided the board into 4 columns, one for each of the patients. Under each column, Julia listed key details, including dates, medical symptoms, and environmental factors that could be relevant. As the board began to fill up, the team searched for any common factors that could help narrow their search for the source of the bacteria. At some point, Julia had written a ton on this board and just stepped back and looked at it. And when she did, she saw it. 3 of the 4 patients showed signs that the infection had entered their brains, including the patients in Texas, Georgia, and Minnesota. Julia realized that this common thread could be an important clue as to how the bacteria entered the bodies of these patients. If their brains were infected, the bacteria most likely entered their body through their noses rather than through a cut or something they ate or drank, because the quickest route to the brain was through the nasal cavity, meaning there was a very good chance that in all of these cases, the bacteria was somehow inhaled. Julia felt re-energized. Even though CDC investigators had now made multiple trips to the victims' homes to collect samples, Julia knew, now that they had this information about inhaling the bacteria, that they would have to visit all of them one more time. Minutes later, Julia left and headed back to her apartment and began to pack. Suitcase. Over the weeks that followed, Julia and her colleagues returned to the homes of all 4 patients and retrieved more samples for testing. They collected anything and everything they could find that could possibly be inhaled, regardless of whether it could have come from Asia. Julia and her colleagues knew they were ultimately searching for a needle in a haystack, but they had to try. And so by September, Julia and the rest of the CDC team had sent hundreds of additional specimens to their laboratory for analysis. And finally, in October of 2021, Julia received a call from a microbiologist who was assigned to this case. The search was finally over. A sample retrieved from the Georgia site contained traces of the melioidosis bacteria. And so after hearing this, it didn't take long for Julia and her team to figure out how the bacteria actually made the trip from Asia to America, causing 4 Americans to be attacked by a bacteria so toxic that the government considered it a potential bioweapon. But in the case of 4-year-old Lila Baker, the spread of the bacteria actually got an assist from a very unusual accomplice. 7 months earlier, in March of 2021, while Josie was watching Lila hunt for frogs near the stream behind their house, the family's beloved pet raccoon, Jinx, was busy ransacking their kitchen. Jinx was on a hunt for food, and he had made a huge mess as he opened every cabinet and drawer, ripping open boxes and bags in search of a tasty snack. Jinx eventually climbed onto the counter near the sink, and he saw a small bottle of liquid. The raccoon soon knocked the bottle off the counter, causing it to break open and spill onto the kitchen floor, releasing that very strong floral aroma into the kitchen. And then, when Josie and the kids entered the house, Jinx made a run for it, hopping into that puddle and tracking that floral-smelling liquid throughout the house as he ran away to hide. The bottle that Jinx knocked off the shelf was a United States branded product that Josie bought at Walmart a few weeks earlier. And that same product had been purchased by all 4 of the households that had been struck by melioidosis. What Josie and the other families did not realize is that while they had all bought this American product at a local American store, it was actually manufactured and bottled at a factory near the southern tip of India. The bacteria that causes melioidosis was known to thrive in the wetter environments of this particular region of India. And somehow, in the process of manufacturing thousands of bottles of this air freshener, known as Better Homes and Gardens Lavender and Chamomile Essential Oil Infused Aromatherapy Room Spray, the bacteria got into the liquid inside. The bottles were then shipped to Walmart stores all across the United States. When customers used the product inside their home, particles of the melioidosis bacteria were sprayed into the air, where they were all inhaled by the people who lived there. Now, most of the people who inhaled the bacteria were healthy enough to fight off the bacteria, and they did not get seriously ill, but the victims in Kansas and Minnesota had other conditions that made them more vulnerable to this infection. And Lila and the young boy in Georgia were just so young that their immature immune systems were unable to fight off the bacteria before serious damage was done to their bodies. As soon as the source of this bacteria was identified, the CDC alerted Walmart, and Walmart quickly discontinued sale of the product and withdrew it from the market. Consumers who purchased the spray were told not to throw it away or pour it down the drain, since that could increase the risk of spreading the bacteria. Instead, they were directed to put the bottle inside of 2 Ziploc bags, then place it inside of a cardboard box, and then physically return it to a Walmart store. But that was not quite the end of this story. CDC investigator Julia Petrus eventually learned of a 5th potential victim of this strain of the melioidosis bacteria: Jinx, the Baker family's beloved pet raccoon, who died shortly after breaking the bottle that contained the contaminated air freshener. Julia hated the idea of disturbing Jinx's grave in the Baker's backyard, but there was a chance that the melioidosis bacteria had actually spread into the environment after he was buried. And so, on April 19, 2022, Julia and other CDC officials returned to the Baker's home in Texas and dug up Jinx's body. But after doing some analysis, Julia and the Baker family were relieved to discover that although Jinx had died of melioidosis, no additional bacteria was detected in the soil or vegetation surrounding Jinx's grave. As of late 2023, Lila Baker has not regained her ability to speak or walk. Josie quit her job at the animal hospital and devoted herself full-time to the care of her daughter. Sadly, the little boy in Georgia died from the infection. However, the other 2 human patients did make full recoveries. Was studying French at the University of Oregon. That summer, she was invited to go on a camping trip with some very close friends and some people she had not met before. Their destination was this beautiful spot along the Sierra Nevada mountain range in California, but as soon as they got there, Katie did not take in any of the beautiful scenery. Instead, she fixated solely on 25-year-old James Kim, who was one of those people she had not met before that was going on this trip. And for the people that were on this trip, they would say James and Katie immediately just fell in love with each other. And for the duration of this trip, they were inseparable. And then when they got back from this trip, James would actually move from Seattle to Oregon to be with Katie. And then after Katie graduated from college, the two got married in Las Vegas and then settled in San Francisco. James, who loved technology and always had, was quickly hired by a tech company to try out new technology and then write a review for the average consumer. Basically, James got paid to play with toys, and so he loved his job. The couple also opened 2 boutique stores in San Francisco. One was an apothecary and the other sold eccentric clothing, and those 2 shops were managed by Katie full-time. By 2006, the Kim family had become very successful financially, and they had grown in size. They had a 4-year-old daughter named Penelope and a 7-month-old daughter named Sabine. Katie and James both adored their kids, but James especially was known for blowing off virtually everything and anyone to be with his daughters. In fact, his friends and family would say you couldn't even have a conversation with James if his daughters were in the room, because James would get distracted and just stare at his daughters and then would eventually just leave mid-conversation to go play with them. James was also known to bring his daughters to work virtually every chance he got, even if it really wasn't allowed at this company. On Friday, November 17th, James, Katie, and their 2 daughters loaded up into their station wagon and then drove north to Seattle. They planned on spending Thanksgiving with James's aunt and uncle who lived in the city. And also, James and Katie were considering leaving San Francisco and moving elsewhere, and Seattle seemed like a natural landing spot for them. So this trip served nicely as a chance to see family and to explore the area. And so late on Friday night, after a very long trip, they finally arrive in Seattle, and for the next couple of days, they have a wonderful time visiting with family and having Thanksgiving dinner. On Friday, November 24th, so a day after Thanksgiving, James, Katie, and their daughters loaded back up into the station wagon early in the morning. They said bye to James's aunt and uncle, and then they hit the road. But instead of just driving straight all the way to San Francisco, which would have taken the entire day and then some, they decided to make a stop in Portland, Oregon, where one of Katie's very close friends from college was going to meet them for lunch. And so after about 3.5, 4 hours, they arrive in Portland, they meet Katie's friend, and they have this nice lunch. And then afterwards, the family retired to a hotel where they crashed for the night. The next morning, the plan was originally to just get in the car and then drive all the way back to San Francisco, but Katie suggested to James that instead of just driving all day, why don't we just stay here for part of the day, leave in the afternoon, and we'll stop somewhere between here and home. We'll break up the drive one more time. James thought it was a great idea. They pulled out the map, and Katie found a nice family-friendly vacation spot that was almost exactly halfway between where they were and home. It was called the 22-Ton Lodge, and it was located on the coast of Oregon in a town called Gold Beach. And so James and Katie think, perfect, this is exactly what we needed. Katie calls the lodge, and she makes reservations for that night. And so that afternoon, after the family spent their nice day in Portland, they hopped in the car and they began traveling south towards the 22-Ton Lodge. At about 8:30 p.m., the family was still on the road making their way when James got really hungry and said, let's pull over and get a bite to eat. So the family pulls over at a Denny's restaurant in Central Oregon. They go inside, and then after a quick bite to eat, they get back out and they're on the road at 9 p.m. From the Denny's to the lodge was about a 2.5-hour drive. But after driving for 2 more hours, James realized they had missed a turn. So he told Katie about it, they looked at the map, and they realized if they were to backtrack all the way to that turn, it would add several more hours onto their trip. And so they began looking for an alternative path. And they found one. Instead of going all the way west to the coast and then all the way south to this lodge, which was the original plan, they could just go south from where they were all the way until they were parallel with this lodge. And then from there, they could just cut west along this road called Bear Camp Road. It would basically go straight to their destination. But what this map did not do a good job of explaining was just how dangerous Bear Camp Road was. It started at 900 feet of elevation, but very quickly went all the way up to 4,000 feet of elevation before it went over the backside of this mountain down to Gold Beach and where this lodge was. While the road is paved, it's incredibly narrow and it's basically cut into a mountainside, and so there's very steep drop-offs throughout most of this ride, and there are no guardrails protecting people from falling off. The summer is really the only time people should be on Bear Camp Road because that's when the road is maintained. In the winter, the road is not plowed, it's not maintained, and so even a light snowstorm could make the road totally impassable. And the road cuts through a very remote section of Oregon where there's just not many people around. So if you get in trouble out there, you're probably on your own. But the Kims were not aware of the dangers this road possessed, and so after going south for a while, they did turn on to Bear Camp Road and began slowly driving up the mountain. And so as James is driving, Katie falls asleep in the passenger seat, the girls fall asleep in back, and outside it begins to snow. An hour later, Katie wakes up from her sleep, and the first thing she notices is outside, it is snowing so hard that James now has the windshield wipers on full blast, and still you could barely see out the front windshield. She looked at her husband, and he was hunched over, white-knuckling the steering wheel, looking intently out the window, and she says to him, what's going on? Should we stop? Should we turn around? And James, without even looking at her, says, yeah, honey, I do want to turn around, but the road is so narrow, we can't. And then he would tell his wife that earlier, they had actually driven through a fork in the road where there was enough space to turn around, and so now he was just hopeful that there'd be another fork somewhere that would allow them to turn around. And so Katie was not excited about the idea, but she trusted James and said, okay, let's keep going. And so James just continues driving up this mountain pass, and you got to understand, they are driving on basically a cliff. On the left side, left of James, is just a sheer drop off, and the road is totally slick from the snow. And so periodically, as James is driving, even though he's only going about 5 miles an hour, he would begin to slip and slide, and he's right on the edge of this cliff. And so it was a very, very stressful ride, and after several more miles of this, they were not reaching any turnaround. In fact, they would have to periodically stop on inclines, put up the emergency brake, and one of them would have to get out and clear branches and rocks out of this tiny little road to continue onward. And so finally, Katie says to James, you gotta stop, you gotta back out of here. That's our only choice right now. And so James put the car in reverse, and he opens his car door so he can look down at the edge of this cliff to make sure he doesn't accidentally veer off of it. And so very slowly, without even applying the gas, he began going in reverse, making sure he didn't go off the cliff. And for hours and hours they did this. This must have been so stressful. But finally, they make it to this fork in the road that James had seen much earlier, and they're able to make a decision. They had two paths they could take. They could turn around completely and drive nose out along the path they came in on all the way to the highway, but that was a very far drive, and they knew that road was treacherous and there was a cliff drop off, and it was really just as dangerous as what they had been on, and they really were not keen to be on that road considering the weather. Or they could turn left and go down the mountain on this path that was way wider than the paths they were on. It was like this huge road, and it looked like it went straight to the bottom of the mountain. And they're thinking, we don't know where this goes. The signage is not clear where this goes, but you got to figure if you're going lower in elevation, the weather will not be as bad. And maybe if you go down this road, there'll be houses, or there'll be a gas station, or there'll be something. But whatever it is, it's probably better than going that way or that way. And so James turned the car and began driving down this new road. Unfortunately, this was the worst choice they could have made. This road they were now on was this long, winding dead end that was used by loggers in the summer. Now, normally, this mistake by the Kim family would have been caught because there was supposed to be a big yellow gate that sat across this road just a little ways past this fork, blocking all traffic from proceeding any further. But vandals had recently come up and cut the lock on this gate, swung it open, and then locked it open. So the gate is completely off the road. And so as the Kims drove past where they normally would have been stopped, they didn't even see a gate. There was no gate anywhere, and so they just kept on driving. And from where this gate should have been, the road went from paved to dirt and full of potholes, and it narrowed considerably. The couple drove for 15 miles on this very tight, winding road that once again was on a cliffside until finally they reached another fork in the road where they could either go right or they could go straight, but there was no sign telling them which way led to what. And so James stopped the car right in the middle of this intersection, and he and Katie look at each other and they know they're in trouble. So they get their phones out and they try calling for help, but they have no service. And so as they're struggling to place calls, one of them realizes it's no longer snowing. It's actually raining, and a lot of the snow on the ground seems to be getting washed away. And so after not being able to place calls for several minutes, they decide, you know what, it's 2 a.m, we're tired, let's sleep here, we'll leave the car running, it'll be nice and warm, and when we wake up in the morning, this rain will most likely have washed away the snow, and we can just drive out of here. And so the two are kind of relieved as they're saying this out loud that this situation is not nearly as bad as it seems, we'll be just fine. And so Katie, James, their 2 daughters, they fall asleep with the car running. It's nice and warm. And when they wake up, Katie and James realize it's gotten much, much worse. At some point in the night after they fell asleep, the temperature must have dropped again, and that rain became very heavy snow. And so all the water on the ground froze, and then almost a foot of snow fell on top of it. They were stuck. But Katie and James, they didn't panic because they remembered when they first turned onto Bear Camp Road, they had seen a plow truck parked off of the side of the road. And so to them, that meant if it snowed along Bear Camp Road, it would get plowed. And so that day, the Kims just stayed inside of their car and they ate snacks and they read books and they kept the heater on and they waited to be rescued. But over the course of that entire day, nobody came down that road. No plows, no anybody. And Katie and James continuously tried their cell phones to try to punch out and get some help, but they never had any service. Also, Katie and James continuously honked the horn in case someone was in the area that might hear them, but no one ever came to their rescue. And so by the end of that Sunday night, Katie and James were really starting to get worried because they have a 4-year-old and a 7-month-old. They cannot be out here for very much longer. But they began to tell each other that, you know what, it's Sunday, maybe the plows don't come through on Sundays. Maybe they just don't work out here on Sundays. And so tomorrow, Monday, the plows will be out here, they'll come by and they will save us. Also, Katie and James began telling each other to reassure each other that, hey, tomorrow, Monday, that's the day we were supposed to be back in San Francisco. And so people are bound to notice our absence and they will report it to police and they will come out here and they will save us. So tomorrow we are going to get found. And so Katie and James, they put their 2 daughters in their car seats and James read them some bedtime stories and then the family fell asleep. The next day, Monday, the family did a lot of the same things they did the day before. They sat in their car, they kept spirits high, they tried to use their cell phones, which didn't work, they honked their horns to get people's attention, that didn't work, they tried to ration their food, and the whole time, they're keeping their eyes up each side of this road they're on in hopes a plow comes through. But all day long, no trucks, no plows, nothing comes down this road. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, the family's absence was noticed by a family friend, but they didn't report it to police because they figured the Kim family had just decided to stay out a little bit longer and they would be back soon. By Monday night, Katie and James were officially terrified. They were almost out of fuel in their car. They were almost out of food. In fact, to compensate for their low amount of food, Katie had begun not only breastfeeding her 7-month-old, but also began breastfeeding her 4-year-old. Also, outside of their car, bears began kind of assembling and checking them out. And at first, Katie and James would scream and yell and try to scare them off, but the bears ultimately were not that fazed by them. They were not aggressive, but it meant the family did not feel comfortable getting out of their car. And so they're in this very claustrophobic situation where they are literally trapped inside of this small car where all the windows are covered with snow and they can't go anywhere, they can't call anyone, they're running out of their supplies. I mean, this is a terrifying situation to be in. Katie and James had been really strong to this point, but around this time, they began to act scared, and their kids picked up on it, and they started acting scared and fearful. And so the parents were trying their best to calm them down and tell them everything's going to be fine and they're going to get out of here soon. But in reality, Katie and James knew that if they didn't get found soon, they were probably going to die. The next day when they woke up, which was Tuesday, again, no cars or trucks came down either road. There was no plows. The snow just continued to pile up, and the food was running unbelievably low to the point where James actually left the car and went out looking for bear droppings because there's bears all over the place now, and he would pull the berries out of their droppings, and he and Katie began eating those. But after a while, they decided that was not a good idea because they might poison themselves. Their daughters, who the day before had been acting out of fear and anxiety, were now lethargic and quiet. And the parents' response to this was to start fighting with each other about whose fault this was, when in reality, they were just totally scared about what might happen to them. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, the family had still not been reported to police. And so that night, Tuesday night, the Kim family once again huddled up inside of their car. James read the kids' books, and then they all fell asleep. The next morning, Wednesday, they ran out of gas for their car. and so they had no way to heat themselves. And so James got the spare tire out of the back of the car, and he rounded up some magazines inside of the car, and he lit a fire for the family to stand around and try to warm up by. And it worked, but the fire very quickly died out, and they couldn't find any wood that wasn't soaking wet to put on it. And so before long, they did not have a fire. And so all day that day, James and Katie were desperately looking up the road in hopes that a car or truck would come through. They never did. James and Katie tried their cell phones repeatedly, but they never got service. They honked their horns and they screamed out for help, but nobody heard them. And so before long, it was dark again, and the family was huddled up inside of their now freezing car, and all they could hear outside was the sounds of bears marching around the area. And so I'm sure James and Katie thought to themselves, I wonder if we'll survive the night. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, that family friend who had noticed the Kims were gone on Monday, she did go to the police on Wednesday afternoon and reported them missing. And so a search party was being organized that night, but of course the Kim family would have no way of knowing that. The next morning, Thursday, the Kim family woke up, they survived the night, but at this point, James and Katie are speaking openly about the real possibility that they all might die. In fact, Katie says to James, you have to promise me if our 2 kids die out here, you have to kill me too. And James said he would. At this point, Katie and James do not believe a truck or a car or anything is going to drive down this road and save them. They believe their only hope of being rescued is by sending a smoke signal up into the air that a pilot might see. So they pull off all 4 tires of their car, and then they pull everything out of the car that might burn, and they stack that on the tires, and that included Penelope's prized stuffed lamb. And then once they had their big pile, they lit it on fire, and fairly quickly, a large black billowing cloud of smoke was going straight up to the sky, and for a minute the Kim family was very optimistic that they were about to be found, that certainly someone was going to see the smoke and come find them. But unfortunately, the fire burned out very quickly, they couldn't light it again, and nobody flew overhead. And so before long, the family is once again huddled inside of their freezing cold car that night. There's bears walking around outside. They're basically out of food. Their kids aren't even crying anymore. They're just silent and cold and miserable. And as they're all shivering and trying to stay warm, James realizes he needs to do something drastic or his family's going to die. And so the next morning, Friday, when they get up, James tells Katie that he had been studying the map and there is a town about 4 miles east called Galice that he believes he can get to in about 2 hours. Katie immediately said, no, you cannot leave us. We need you here. There's probably a search party out there looking for us right now. We need to stay together so we can all be found. But James's instincts were telling him that no one was coming for them, or no one was going to actually find them in time. And so their only hope was if he ventured off and found help. And so Katie finally reluctantly agrees to let him go because he seemed really confident. And so at 7:45 a.m. that morning, James gave his 2 daughters a big hug and a kiss, told them he loved them and he would see them soon, and then he hugged his wife and said he loved her, and then he turned around and walked up the road out of sight. At the same time, unbeknownst to the Kim family, hundreds of searchers and helicopters are all over Bear Camp Road looking for them. 2 days later, on Sunday, December 3rd, so a week after the family had originally gotten stuck, a helicopter pilot that was part of the search effort was flying around Bear Camp Road when he noticed footprints in the snow below. When he started following these footprints, and eventually the footprints kind of disappeared under some trees, and then he couldn't pick them up again, and so without that much fuel left, he decided he would just backtrack and follow the footprints back to their origin. And so he retraced these footprints for quite a while until he came to a clearing, and in the middle of the clearing was a car, and next to the car was Katie waving an umbrella back and forth. The pilot immediately knew who he was looking at, but he didn't have enough fuel to actually land and pick her and her family up. And so instead, he just hovered down as low as he could, and he made good eye contact with her to reassure her that I see you and we're coming for you. And then he marked on the map where they were. He flew off to the search headquarters, and just minutes later, another helicopter was spun up. They flew to that same location, and they were able to land in that clearing. And as soon as the pilot got out, he saw Katie running up to him, carrying her 2 daughters, who looked like they were in pretty good shape. And she's crying tears of joy, and she's thanking him profusely. And then when she's right up in front of him, she says, are you here because of my husband? Did James tell you where we were? And the pilot looked visibly confused. Katie picked up on it, and she explained how just 2 days earlier, James had left to go to the town of Galice to get help, and he still hadn't come back yet. And so at this point, the pilot understood what was happening, and so he looked down and he said, no, ma'am, we still have not found James. Katie was devastated and she cried as she and her daughters were loaded into the helicopter and airlifted out of the forest and brought to a hospital. There they would make full recoveries. Meanwhile, the search effort, which had been all over Bear Camp Road, was suddenly focused exclusively on the area around where their car was. And professional trackers were brought in to look for James's tracks, and they found them fairly quickly and began following them. James, after departing his family to go look for help, which must have been the most difficult decision he had ever made in his entire life. He loved his family more than anything, and he had to abandon them in the middle of the wilderness with no food, with no power, and he has no idea if he'll ever see them again. And so after leaving them behind, he walked 3 miles up the road they came in on, and then instead of just continuing on that road in the direction of Galice, he deviated and walked off the road. He actually went straight down one of the cliffs until he hit a river. And it's believed that maybe he saw the river from up on the road and thought that would be a faster way to get to Galice. But either way, he got down to the river, and as he walked, he would leave behind him little bits of torn clothing and torn paper to create a trail of where he was going, presumably so if he needed to, he could backtrack to his family. And so he gets down to this river, and for several miles he walks downstream. And then after being gone for at least 2 hours and not reaching the town of Galice, he must have realized he had either gone the wrong way, and that's why he had not hit the town, or he had miscalculated the distance, and that's why he had not hit the town. But either way, he did not turn around and go back to his family. Instead, he pressed on, believing he was their only hope. And so on he went, crossing over rivers, getting totally soaked in frigid water. He went up and down mountains all over these totally rugged areas in nothing but street clothes. He had sneakers, pants, and a jacket on. He had no food, he had no water, and he just kept on going until it was nightfall, and he had covered about 10 miles at this point, and he laid down and he went to sleep. And that night must have been absolutely horrible as he thought about his family that was alone in the woods somewhere. He probably wondered if they were still alive. And the temperature was in the 30s, and again, he's just in street clothes. But he survives the night, and so the next morning, that Saturday, he gets up and he's right back at it, despite the fact that he was physically wrecked at this point. But for him, he didn't care. He was doing it for his family. And so all day he hiked in and out of freezing cold streams, up and down mountains, until finally he found himself at the bottom of this deep ravine next to a river where he just fell to his knees, fell forward, and died. He had literally just kept on going, looking for help for his family until he eventually succumbed to hypothermia. James's body was located 2 days after his wife and his daughters were successfully rescued. It would turn out the town of Galice was not 4 miles away from the family's car. It was about 15 miles away, but that's from point A to point B on a map, like a straight line. But when you actually are hiking in the wilderness, you don't go in straight lines because there's mountains and there's rivers and there's things that get in the way. And so in order to get to Galice from where their car was, James would have had to travel 30 or 40 miles, zigging and zagging up over 4 different mountains. And so this was a suicide mission from the start. James ultimately covered 16 miles through some of the most treacherous terrain in the country, wearing nothing but his street clothes. The professional trackers that followed this 16-mile trail to his body, they called his journey superhuman. The helicopter pilot would later say he never would have found Katie and the girls had he not spotted those footprints first and then traced them all the way back to that clearing. And it would turn out those footprints were made by James after he left his family and walked off to get help. And so even though it cost him his life, James did ultimately save his family. So that's going to do it, guys.